Welcome everyone to Hostie's Short-Term Rental Intel Podcast number 26. Today we are excited to welcome Anurag Verma from Pricelabs, co-founder of Pricelabs and leaving the United airline industry, or doing revenue management, working on the algorithms for revenue management for United Airlines, to join the short-term rental industry to bring us an amazing dynamic pricing software, Pricelabs. So thank you for joining us. And also today we have Evan Wilburn, the co-founder of Hostie. And we hope to just have a wonderful conversation, have everyone walk away with some value about dynamic pricing, understanding of dynamic pricing, the intricacies of it, and potentially going out to use it for yourself or using Hostie's management. So Anurag, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Killian, and thanks for that great introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to get started, the broad, 40,000 foot picture, can you tell us in layman's terms, to maybe the first time ever someone being introduced to what dynamic pricing is, what is it? What's the nature of dynamic pricing?
Right. So dynamic pricing, essentially, if you want to go really high level, think of each night on your calendar, if you're in the travel industry or as short-term rental, each night in your calendar as a product, right? Different products have different prices. An iPhone costs different from Google Pixel 6 or whatever. Different cars cost different things because there is a different demand for those things, like each of them individually. Similarly, each night in some ways is a product. If you're in a ski area, a night in February and March is way more valuable than a night in, say, mid-May, where this is mud season, right? So it's essentially saying, hey, the product that you are selling as a short-term rental is not your house, it's nights in the house. And depending on when those nights are, whether it's a weekend or a weekday, whether it's a high season or low season, whether there's a big event going on or not, the demand is different. The value that somebody who's staying there that gets out of it is different, and so they should be priced differently. So that's one piece. That's one part of it being dynamic, that you shouldn't be selling all your nights at the same price. Just like if you have two cars to sell, you won't sell both the cars at the same price. The second part is something that you would probably see in all grocery stores. You would all see it in car dealerships. You see it everywhere, which is the value of time in some ways, where if you're selling vegetables go stale after a while, right? Like you can't sell like rotten tomatoes. That's like you can't sell it for much. Whereas if they're ripe tomatoes, like perfectly ripe, then you can sell it for a reasonable amount, right? Whatever the market can take. Similarly, the value that you are able to sell each night, any given night, whether it be in high season or low season, at different points of time till the night expires. Once the night is gone, like you can't go back and sell April 15th of 2021 at whatever price. Like I mean, somebody will have, like you can't even sell it for $1 because it's worth nothing. Like what does that give us? So that's the other aspect, to say like, okay, it's high season. Depending on how far out it is and depending on what we know about the market, we can say, hey, I should probably sell it for something more or something less. That's in a nutshell. So like I think I tried to bring in some car references, some tomato references,
Yeah,
but I'm hoping that helps.
I've heard you use the analogy where we're not selling cheese. It expires. There's an expiration date. And so when that date arrives, what's the optimal price the market can handle, the market can absorb?
Right. Yeah, and in some ways, if you think of cheese, which comes with an expiry date, there are people who will say, hey, I will use it today, so if it's expiring tomorrow, I'm fine with it. But then the number of such people is few, and whether they'll notice your package of cheese or not, the chances are less. So you kind of have to say, okay, if the demand is less, then I'll have to discount it and sell.
And I had heard you use an analogy, thermostat, essentially. You can look at pricing, you can look at dynamic pricing like a thermostat. I kind of use the analogy, you want meat to be at 300 degrees, right? You can stick a thermometer in there, and you can know, hey, I'm a couple degrees over, I'm a couple degrees under, and I can adjust the the temperature on that oven. Uh, Dive into a little bit. We talked to everyone from the owner who is they're hearing dynamic pricing for the first time from us, all the way to the people who are maybe using some type of dynamic pricing, or are using like a pseudo dynamic pricing, like a smart pricing, or maybe an OTA offered pricing. Could you talk about a little bit that analogy of a thermostat?
Um,
Your 7, 14, 30-day outlook.
all right. I was
Yeah.
beginning to think about like where have I given the oven
I'm sorry.
analogy?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, when you do any kind of revenue management, right? It's
Yes.
not no system out there is set and forget in some ways. Even the best automated systems, and I'm not even talking about pricing. Think about autopilots in flights or whatever Tesla has at this point, right? All of these systems come with some amount of feedback to you as a human being to say, hey, like, is this going well? Is this not going well? Can something be improved upon? And that's what, like, at any point of time, I think the thermometer analogy is more about like being able to monitor and measure at any given point of time what is happening with you, what is happening around you in the market in some ways, to be able to say, okay, like if I'm fairly well booked, like in the next 8 months, what does that tell me? And frequently what that tells you, like if you're super well booked over the next 8 months, is that, hey, if you look at the market trends, plenty of people book, like most of the demand in most destinations comes within the last 8 months. So if you're fully booked over the next 8 months, you potentially might be selling for so much lower than the market that you're being lapped up at the first chance somebody searches and then you get booked, right? It signals that you can increase your prices. Whereas in the next 2 months, if you're like, sitting way below the market, it kind of tells you like, hey, maybe your price is a bit too high. You want to try a few discounts or things like that. And there are mechanisms like in most dynamic pricing systems in Pricelabs to sort of auto correct for those things as well. But still, like as a owner and the manager, you want to be able to have a pulse on what's happening on your systems at any given point.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen it's fun to see Pricelabs evolve and change over time. And one thing, like you said, it's there's no set it and forget it pricing model. It's all, and then two, it's so subjective too in the short term rental world, because each product is different. Every 2 bedroom is not the same. But I've seen Pricelabs kind of move. I don't know, you can confirm this, but from a amenity perspective, you're maybe starting to add in some of the amenities. Hey, people with Wi-Fi tend to be priced this much higher, or people with these certain amenities. Do you feel like that's the way you guys are going, is to try to measure it more subjectively or objectively?
Right. So, I mean, we still think, I mean, what you said is absolutely right. Like, it's not just the amenities and the quality of home. So, for example, you could have a condo building. I don't know if Colorado Springs has that many of them, but say you have a condo building, or say you have 2 houses right next to each other, identical houses, everything is the same about them. Yet you would find that one of them might be booking a lot more than the other, right? And this is with like all amenities the same, everything exactly the same. And it might happen to be that one faces a certain direction, the other one faces the other direction, and the pictures of one of them come out way better than the other for whatever reason, right? Sometimes these are these intangible things. Sometimes there is no difference at all except in perception. So you're not selling a house in some ways. Or you're selling a night at a house, but all you can market is the listing, like what pictures are there, what description is there, and depending on the listing itself, things can change a lot, which is very, very hard to measure. And sometimes the listings are also identical, but one of them got a bad review somewhere and it drops in ranking in Airbnb or VRBO search, and because of that, it stops getting enough bookings. So what we focus a lot on is not just what's physically there on the property, which is amenities, or what's on the listing, like the reviews, but also this constant feedback loop of like, is it getting bookings or not, right? It could be the best listing with the best amenities out there, but if it's not getting bookings, that feedback loop will come and say, hey, you need to be dropping the prices for this one. You're not getting bookings at this price point.
Would
Does
that
that
be
make
what you
sense?
call pacing? Like, hey, what is the pacing of bookings it's getting, or is that?
So pacing can be thought of as two things. One is pacing is essentially at what pace are bookings coming in. Are they coming in too far out or too close in or
Okay.
things like that? Or also pacing can be thought of really as a metric to compare against something. So you pace against something. You never pace in vacuum. I mean, it would be hard to say I'm fast when there is nothing else to compare
There's no
against.
relative measure.
Right. So pacing generally historically used to be how am I pacing against last year, for example, right? So to say the next ski season is coming up or the next summer is coming up. Let's talk about summer. So July is coming up in about 7 months, let's say. At this time for July 2021, 7 months out, how booked was I? So if I look at my July 2022 right now and say, hey, it's 30% booked, is it a good thing or a bad thing? There's no real way to tell other than to say, hey, what happened last year? And that's not to say like if you're ahead of the market or ahead of last year or behind last year, that's necessarily right or wrong. But at least it gives you a sense of like, hey, at this point, I was booked at, say, 20% last year. And eventually I got booked like a solid 85%, which means if I'm already 10% ahead, maybe there's an opportunity to bump up the prices. If July pans out the same way, maybe I'll still hit 85%, but with higher prices. Maybe I need to raise my prices, right? On the flip side, you could say, you can also say pace against the market to say, okay, I'm 30% booked. How booked is the market? And if it looks like the market is sitting completely empty, you're the only one taking all these bookings, then that kind of says, hey, are you that much cheaper than the market that everybody seems to be booking you? Like maybe you should raise rates there as well. So when you do these comparisons against last year or against the market or how the market did last year as well, that's when some of these start becoming useful.
And then the feedback loop you're talking about, would that be more occupancy based pricing? This, hey, your airline's filled up 10% X price, now it's filled up 20% X price.
Correct.
Okay.
To some extent, yes, and we do it in two different ways. So when you think of an airline, they have 100 seats in a plane that they can sell, so they can afford to sell a few of them for cheap for a big event, to then realize that, hey, like usually I should not be 20% booked 7 months out for any flight. If I am, then that indicates there must be some big event happening here and I didn't price properly, right? So they have these systems to then automatically bump up the rates. In short-term rentals, the difficulty as an individual operator comes in where you only have one home. If there is a big event and you can't take feedback from yourself. Once you're booked for that big event, you're booked for that event. I mean, people cancel and stuff like that, but in most cases, you're booked for that event, right? So there's no feedback to say, hey, I just realized there's a big event. Let's raise the prices of the rest of the homes that I have left, which is none. As a property manager, you have a little more leeway, right? You can say, okay, I have 200 homes, and usually 7 months out, it's weekends are 20% booked, and this particular one is 30% booked. And I can go and say, hey, it looks like something is happening, and I can bump up the rates for the remaining properties. And that's what we call portfolio occupancy-based adjustments, where you can create groups and say, across my group on each date, measure how much is happening and do this. But the way we try to solve this problem is by tracking the entire market to say, because even as a property manager, you don't want those first 20% homes to be booked on a big night for cheap, right? Because each homeowner has just one home. Like, just because you sold the remaining 80% at a very expensive price doesn't mean the first 20% get a higher payout for those big nights, right? So the way we try to do this is trying to identify or detect events or big demand nights in a couple of different ways. One is the moment we see a sliver of activity, if it's super far out when people don't usually book, and we see any abnormal activity, it may not be on your homes, but we are tracking the entire market. We go ahead and say, hey, 7 months out, this is what's happening in terms of bookings is abnormal. We are going to bump up rates for these dates. And so even before your properties start getting booked at an abnormal rate, the rates are already high. And then the second one we do, which actually we had to do because of COVID, is proactively looking at what kind of holidays and events can raise prices or have raised prices in the past, and then saying, even before any demand starts showing up for next year, we are going to bump up the rates because we know that eventually this date will be super high demand. So as an example, like Labor Day, suppose nobody is booking right now for next Labor Day, we will still go ahead and say, hey, it looks like last year there was a significantly high demand, and next year, even though we are not seeing anything right now, we are going to bump it up a little bit. So,
I've always wondered how much pricing control. Let's just say we've got a property manager in one market and they manage 10 to 20% of the market.
right.
How much when they change their pricing, does that have a big effect on the rest of the market's pricing? If most people are using dynamic pricing, or does that is it pretty minuscule?
It is pretty minuscule. So
Okay.
One of the things that we saw very early on in this market is you can't follow anybody else's pricing. People have their own reasons to do certain things a certain way. And if you try to follow somebody else's pricing, it can lead to some pretty odd outcomes. So the simplest case I can think of is there are plenty of times especially in urban areas, but also outside, where nobody at all has raised prices for a peak demand day that we can see in our occupancy data that, hey, occupancy is through the roof, but looks like nobody else in the market seems to have spotted this. It might be a big wedding that is not a public event or public information, so nobody really knows about it. But if you just say, hey, nobody else is raising prices, I'm not going to raise prices, then you're missing out on making a lot more on those kinds of days, right? And on the flip side, there are times when owners or managers on request from owners tend to set prices too high on certain events, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then again, sometimes they might be setting it too high to say, hey, I want to come and live here, but if somebody books it for $2,000 a night, sure, I'll cancel my plans. Like, I'll take that money. And when that happens, again, you don't want to look at that and say, oh, sure, it seems like something really big is happening.
We almost don't do hardly any benchmarking against the rest of the market because of that reason. Like, basically, you've got a bunch of rent by owner people who are just doing static pricing, and if we were going to benchmark against them, we would end up with just super bad pricing.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's a lot better to look at trends in occupancy than trends in how are other people pricing. I still would say it's beneficial to do benchmarking, even though it's rent by owners. There's collective wisdom in some ways. Like if there are
absolutely
400 RBOs out there, then there will be a few outliers, but then plenty of folks have been even RBOs are pretty savvy, right? Like you can look at the collective wisdom and say, hey, it looks like everybody seems to know something is going on this date, at least to find out is something happening that we have missed, right?
But I think, like you said, we're at 200 homes, we're likely going to know about an unordinary special event because we're going to have some houses surging in demand before maybe the individual.
And you're talking about your neighborhood data pulling from, it's the nearest 300 homes. Is that correct?
We do nearest 350. Yep.
And I mean, a human being can only take that so far. You can only start crunching that information. I mean, you have some folks who've been doing this off of VRBO and even later or even earlier who've been doing their own pricing. And it's interesting to see they're basically doing their revenue management, but there really is no revenue management strategy. Their strategy is really, they've just been reacting very well to the collective wisdom of the 10 or 15 or 50 properties they've managed to look at on one
Right.
OTA.
Yeah, and you can't say that's not a strategy. That's still a strategy to say go monitor a few customers or a few competitors that you regard well in some ways, right?
True.
But then again, the trouble with some of these strategies can be, one, they're very labor intensive. Like going and like you can't. I mean, you can probably, if you have nothing else going on, go and check these 15 listings on OTAs as frequently as a system can do. And the benefit that gets is, like, for example, today, a lot of folks I know uh, do revenue management or do pricing sort of, or at least this was true a few years back, would do it like once a year. In the beginning of the year, you set the seasonal prices. You look at what everybody else is charging, and then you go say, okay, I want to be in the middle of it, right? And there are two things that are that can be improved upon in that setup. One is being in the middle of it. You might be like let's call it an average property in the area. Out of those 15, you are like sort of the there are some higher end, some lower end, and you're in the middle. That doesn't mean that you should be priced at the middle all the time. So, for example, in low season, if the occupancy in the area is going to be 20%, demand is really, really low, and you're in the middle, there is a chance that you don't get booked, whereas you want to try and get booked till a certain point. Like you shouldn't lower your rates below where you're comfortable with, or things like that. And then on the flip side, if you know that there are certain dates in summer where like demand is through the roof, everything is getting booked, then why be in the middle? You can be somewhere further up and still have a pretty good chance of booking. Like yeah, that's just money that's waiting to be taken in some ways.
Do you have maybe just an average of someone who's moving from, pardon me, let's just say smart pricing from Airbnb onto true dynamic pricing software, Pricelabs? What do you think is the average increase of revenue?
That one is hard to answer because smart pricing sometimes does things very strangely. Like they tend to really lowball the prices, right? Uh, I have a better answer for somebody who's doing it manually and doing it well, or somebody who's just not doing it. Like there are folks who just set a flat rate all year. Uh, and in such cases, like the benefits can be like closer to 40-50%, right? Because what happens when you set one flat rate all year is in high season, you're really losing the opportunity to sell at a much higher rate. And seasonality, especially in sort of mountain markets, seasonality is big. Like it, between low season and high season, occupancy rates and prices can be significantly different. So by setting one single price all year, you're losing out on, in high season, you could have charged more. You're probably fully booked in high season. And then in low season, you're probably priced so high that you're not getting very many bookings. And you might think that, hey, this is a seasonal market, I don't get low season bookings. But there might be low season bookings to be taken, just that you are not getting them, right? So that's where the benefit comes in, and it can be significant. And then the other one is somebody who does recognize these things, somebody who does manual pricing, where the benefit is going to be closer to 10 to 20%. That comes from automation of some of the strategies to say, okay, if something is not sold and it's last minute, let's try to lower the rates and get it booked. Or there might be an event or a holiday that is slipping under the radar that you didn't pick up in your initial research, or it wasn't even there when you did the initial research. It got announced later on, and then dynamic pricing software will likely pick it up. Whereas if you haven't looked at it or haven't been monitoring markets frequently enough, you might miss it.
And
so
is this feedback loop happening once an hour and then being synced every 24 hours? Is kind of what's the schedule that this is being done?
So we do it once a day. In most cases, in most markets, we see there aren't that many significant shifts happening from like 1 hour to the next, for example. Like a few properties will get booked during the day, but then in the grand scheme of things, like given how big most markets are, it's not causing significant shift if you keep doing it once every like hour or something like that. The feedback loop I was talking about. So this is a feedback loop where we try to figure out market trends by looking at what's happening in the market. The other feedback loop is what's happening to your property, where and this is where those occupancy-based adjustments or the base price, those things come in, where you say, I have 10 properties, one of them is not getting enough bookings. So in our dashboards, you would start seeing that in red to say, hey, go look at this one, like what's happening. Our system will automatically try to lower the prices for the ones that are not getting booked using that occupancy-based adjustment. So you can set up rules to say, even before I can go and look, do something about it. But then if it's still not getting booked, if it's still showing up in red, you can come and say, let's go look at it. Like, let's go look at the listing. Why is it not getting booked? Are the prices competitive? Is something else wrong? And things like that.
Cool. No, that's awesome. Let's maybe talk about like what your future outlook on pricing, revenue management, maybe pricing optimization. Like, are we fully optimized already in terms of how dynamic pricing works, or is there a long way to go? Like, where do you think we are at in the industry in terms of pricing?
There's a long way to go. Yeah. I mean, so I'm a data scientist, so like we tend to like look at holes more than anytime we look at the data, we are like, okay, no matter how much work you put in an algorithm, you will find cases where like, hey, this doesn't seem right, and then you go work on that one, and then it's a feedback loop for us as well, right? To say, okay, is the algorithm performing as well as it could have? And then if the answer is no, which it will always be no, there's always something you can improve on, whether it be in what other inputs can be going into the feedback loop, or you have something else altogether, like a new data source that can be added to help improve pricing.
Is it kind of like peeling back the onion and there's just always more layers of nuance?
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, when there is always an extra layer that you could go to. What you have to be careful against, and what we have to be careful against, is like you don't increase the complexity so much in doing that there is benefit to being I don't want to say simple, but explainable, like to be able to say, hey, this is happening because of that other thing.
Yeah.
You don't want to get into like throwing 100 different inputs at it, where like 90% of the market might be getting explained by looking at a certain part of the market data. But then you go and say, hey, let's put in this data feed, let's put that data feed. And you suddenly get to a point where like most of the model is coming up with noise in some ways, right? Like, so you don't want to overwhelm it either. So like that's sort of the...
What would be some things you see people start throwing in that data that overwhelm it? Like, as you were speaking, one of the things that comes to mind is sometimes a rent by owner likes to do very, very specific things to their property that you can't really objectively say is adding any monetary value to the property. Do you see people trying to drag data points into pricing that add noise to the data, that you're saying, hey, don't bring that in here?
Or it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's just static, and people keep wanting to bring it into the conversation.
Do you have an example of something?
Like, the example would be like, a lot of people like to put, this one particular lady I was speaking to likes to iron her pillowcases. She irons every single pillowcase before she puts it on the bed. And in her mind, that adds a lot of value monetarily to her home. So she's bringing, it's kind of going into opinion, but she's kind of bringing something into pricing that is somewhat irrelevant. Do you, on a higher level, that's a very low level analogy, but on a higher level, do you see things being introduced into pricing conversations that really should be left out?
Wow.
They don't move the needle.
Yeah, they don't move the needle. I mean, people are talking about them, but they just don't move the needle.
Well, I think what you were saying is like, hey, we don't want to add like labels of data that have low weights. Like they don't move anything. They don't have an effect. Like we want to focus on
Kind
high
of,
weighted,
or
maybe.
they might have an effect, but it's better to measure that effect, again going back in that feedback loop, rather than do it explicitly. And the reason being, there's so suppose this example of um, the perfectly ironed
Yeah, sure.
pillowcases, right? Suppose they were truly valuable. You and I think that it's not valuable, but suppose they were truly valuable. It would show up in, well, when somebody is booking the place, it's hard for them to see whether the pillowcases are ironed or not unless you put a picture and specify that, right? Like
Exactly.
pillowcases would be ironed when you come in. But if they were truly valuable, you probably will put a picture of it. And you probably will get reviews of the prop. Like when people come and stay and leave, the reviews would be raving about it, and they would be 5-star reviews. And because of that, the property will keep getting booked a lot because people are really enjoying their stay here. And what that would do then is, in our dashboard, it will show up as like green or blue to say, hey, like you are really getting well booked. Like you should think of bumping up your base price. So in some ways, it's we like to say some of these small variables that may or may not add to the value. It's better to incorporate the effect of those implicitly using that feedback loop, rather than explicitly saying, because you have the you know, whatever the the pillowcases that are ironed, you're
Boom.
getting more.
Yeah.
But you say, hey, because you're getting booked more, you should raise your prices.
You know,
And then maybe on the operational side, you have a different kind of a analysis which says, hey, which properties are doing well and what can we identify that they are doing differently that's making them do well, so that then you can replicate and say, like, tell the other owners that, hey, go iron your pillowcases.
well,
Because
and you're diving into customizations, specific customizations, groups of homes, and diving in
Yeah.
custom. Yeah, and I mean that's a whole nother topic or rabbit hole we could go down.
That was such a light bulb moment when you just said like explicit versus, yeah, I mean, that's awesome. Yeah.
Wonderful. Heck, I mean,
So what is so where's Pricelabs going? I mean, where do you guys see yourselves going in terms of which customers you want to serve and what new features you guys want to add over the coming years?
Right. So this year has been sort of phenomenal in many ways, in more than one ways, right? So like on the product side, a few very significant updates came through, and one of them, which is easy to notice, is we sort of did this whole UI revamp to bring ourselves to the 21st century, as some people have said. But then also the new products, portfolio analytics and market dashboards, and being able to observe what's happening in your properties, in your markets. Even if you don't have a property in an area, you can go today and say, hey, how much did an average 2-bedroom in this area make last year, or how much did a professionally managed 2-bedroom make this in this area last year, right? So we added those kinds of tools, which has been super helpful. And I don't know if it's because of it or of something else, but we have seen tremendous growth in both these segments, the rent by owners as well as professional managers. And on both spectrums, like plenty of rent by owners started on Pricelabs this year, and then plenty of really large property managers also did. So which is exciting to see, but it means that we have to like build tools that can cater to both ends of the spectrum in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Couple of things that we are focusing on right now, and that will be the focus in the coming year as well. One is the customizations themselves. Like there are a few things that can be done that can really help automate a few other things. So one of those is, for example, improving the seasonal settings themselves. So like today you can set minimum prices and maximum prices by season. But in most cases, we actually recommend not doing that. Like our algorithm takes care of those. And maybe you can set seasonal minimums, right? But then one of the possibilities that I'm excited about is being able to say, hey, today we have this minimum stay automation where you can say far out, have the minimum stay at 7 nights. As it gets closer, drop it to 4, then drop it to 3, then drop it to 2, and if there is a gap, then fill the gap. And then we are going to add a capability where you can do this by season. So you can say in summer, I want to have this profile like 732. In winter, I want this. In fall, I want this other thing. And in spring, I want this other thing. So in some ways, it for the savvy customers, it can be super powerful to be able to control those things. The other thing I'm super excited about on that front is we have been working on providing recommendations for what the right minimum stay should be by lead time or by season, for example.
Oh, phenomenal.
So right now, like we provide the automation, but we ask you to put in to say, hey, I want a 7-night minimum far out, and then I want. But what can happen is maybe you haven't looked at the market enough. We have market dashboards and this kind of data to show in your market. If you put your minimum stay at 7 nights far out, like, are you missing out on a lot of demand or not? Or maybe all of the demand is less than 7 nights, in which case, like, if you think you will get a 7-night, then you're turning away a significant portion of the demand, right? But being able to get recommendations from us and then being able to see some of the data itself is hopefully going to be a lot of value add to say, okay, I don't just have the automation, I also have guidance on how to use this automation.
That's going to be extremely powerful.
Incredible. Well, I've always felt like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've always felt like, you talked about the UI development, but I've always felt like Pricelabs is really focused on the meat and not the dressing. And so, like, you're really focusing on the core product and how it works. And
so that's been our philosophy. Sort of our founding team was all engineers, and all backend engineers. Like, we love to make things work, not necessarily make things that look pretty. But over time, as we have grown, we have gotten that feedback as well to say, like, when somebody new looks at it, if you're tech savvy, and if you understand how systems work, you sort of ignore that stuff and you're like, okay, how does this work? Show me that. But if you are coming in at a new product and you haven't understood what all it can do, if it looks a little dated, it might dent your confidence in it, rightly or wrongly. But you might say, hey, if it doesn't look great, I don't know if it'll work great.
What's interesting is you see folks typically move from doing their pricing on the website, VRBO, Airbnb typically, right?
Yeah.
And those websites, especially like Airbnb, when they brought so much market awareness to this industry, they had a very interactive, user-friendly, aesthetically pleasing interface, right?
Yeah.
And so when you say, bringing it to the 21st century, like Evan was saying, I mean, just focusing on the nuts and bolts, and then the flash can kind of to come later. And we've almost had a very almost identical mentality here at Hosty. So when I'm nothing against any other dynamic pricing software. I've reviewed a ton of them and been through the demos and whatnot, and just in some respects, I think that maybe that time was allocated to a little different areas than where you guys allocated time and resources, and I appreciate that. One thing I want to ask you is, one market section we're seeing grow is your 30, 60, 90-day stays, your midterm stays. We're not using really true dynamic pricing to achieve pricing on those type of homes. Could you speak to that? Is that in the making? Is that becoming a hotter topic?
We're not using any algorithm.
Yeah,
but
that's a
we
better way
are
of saying
dynamically.
it.
Yeah, so
That's
we're
a
doing
much
some
better way of
sort of
saying it. Yes.
dynamic. Yeah.
So sort of you set monthly prices.
30 days, 60 days, you're traveling nurses, corporate rentals, midterm rentals, furnished midterm rentals.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a difficult topic to address, I would say, to start off. The reason being that the longer the stay is, so remember how we started off by saying each stay is like you're selling nights on a home, right? And then each night is different. That this weekend is different from that weekend, and that weekend is different from the weekend after, and so on. And which is why you need to reduce prices and stuff. With monthly stays, if it's a 90-day stay, now you're selling wholesale in some ways. You're not, there's no point in some ways differentiating, saying, hey, the price is higher because you're staying over a big event in the area. If they're coming for 90 days, they're not coming for that event. They're coming to stay for 90 days. The value they get out of those is not because there's a big event happening. So in some ways, you have to then find where that trade-off is. So for example, like the way I tend to think of it is, and I'm hoping we can come up with some automation for this as well. Like I was saying, the minimum stay settings, one of the long-term goal is able to also be able to say, hey, if you were to set monthly discounts, to say, if it's a monthly stay, how much should I discount? That itself is valuable. So the way to think about is, suppose I have a normal month where I book 4 short-term stays, like a 7-night stay, a 3-night stay, a 8-night stay, and a, say, 2-night stay. And then there are gaps in between that end up not getting filled. And let me say, I mean, this seems like a less than ideal case. Like most homes should get booked a little more than that. But out of 30 days, you book 20 days at your nightly rates, quote unquote. If instead you had sold the entire month, all your 30 days are booked. So potentially you would have sold, like in first case, you sold 20 nights, but you sold it at the full nightly rate. Instead, you could have sold all 30 nights at a slightly discounted rate. And in some ways, you can say, okay, if the discount was, 33%, then I would be somewhat be okay taking one long stay, which books out my month, instead of taking all of these shorter stays. But that's not really all the way accurate, because what generally happens, the 20 days that got booked are potentially also including weekends, which are priced higher and those kinds of things. So the true discount that you should get, like the amount of revenue you make from these 20 nights is probably somewhere close to 80 or 85%. So like you should probably give a 15 to 20% monthly discount.
Okay.
So
Well, that's that's what we've been trying to do, is how do we combine short term, midterm, and how do we do it seasonally? Like we want to do midterms in our slow season because we know, and then do short term the rest of the year. But you know, we almost need good data to be able to make that decision, because it just depends on the year.
And this is somewhat born out of necessity, because some places short-term rental permitting restrictions will only allow for 30 plus day stays. And what you just said was, I mean, the type of person that's staying for 30 days is different than the type of person that's staying for 90 days, and could even be different than the person for 60 days. A lot of them are 30 to 45 day stays. So it's somewhat born out of necessity, but could you actualize being a completely dynamic property management company by being able to maneuver both of these industries with ease and with incredibly powerful pricing?
Right. And then the other part of it comes down to distribution as well. Like you can figure out ideal pricing, but then depending on the OTA or depending on the PMS or the channel manager, you may not always be able to distribute that ideal pricing across both. So like, for example, like the simplest case I can take off is most OTAs, most PMSs, most channel managers allow for a nightly price. I mean, they kind of the basic. And then they allow for a monthly discount. So in a lot of places, all you can do is that. Now, Airbnb recently added this thing where you can not just specify a monthly discount, but for a month, each month you can specify a different price as well. Now, that's adding a new layer of complexity, right? To say, okay, it's not just daily prices and monthly discounts. You can set different daily prices and completely unrelated monthly prices. And that's very powerful. But not every channel manager and not every PMS currently supports it. They will have to eventually, given how the market has been moving.
It opens up a little bit of a different accounting issue as well.
Last question. So we've been actually looking into this in terms of there almost needs to be some sort of, and maybe you can just completely squash this and say it's a dumb idea, but there needs to be almost some dynamic pricing for cleaning labor or cleaning rates or maintenance labor, like some type of marketplace where that the value of that labor can be measured in some way. Have you guys thought about that at all in terms of dynamically price, like kind of like an Uber, where the driver rates change based on the demand and the surge in demand,
Yeah.
in terms of cleaning labor, maintenance labor.
Yeah. So are you saying more like would the cleaning fee be dynamic
Yeah,
depending on?
possibly like the cleaning fees dynamic, or on the back end, you know,
Yeah.
basically they
So
work in conjunction to change, like, hey, this clean popped up and the cleaning fee's low because there's a low demand. Maybe it's just a bad idea. I don't know.
no, I mean
I like
the
it.
straightforward application I can think of is plenty of customers uh, set a restriction to say no checkouts or check-ins allowed on Christmas Day.
Okay.
Because if a check-in and check-out are happening on the same day, it's tough to find cleaners to work
Yeah.
on a Christmas Day. It's tough to find anybody to work on a Christmas Day, right? And so what do you do? Like on the flip side, you could say maybe like this can be incentivized to say like, hey, if you do want to check out, pay $1,000 and somebody will be ready to clean it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was. Yeah. Okay, that's awesome.
Um,
How you put that.
but then this also again goes back to distribution, right? Currently, as far as I know, on most OTAs, there is one cleaning fee. The cleaning fee does not depend on length of stay, does not depend on when you're checking in or checking out or things like that. So the distribution landscape would need to change a little bit to then possibly allow
Okay.
optimizing. Like first, it needs to change to allow for charging variably, and then you need to say, okay, what's the right number now for each night?
Because on a hot night like a Saturday in July, it's a lot easier to swallow a $500 cleaning fee when your nightly rate is $1,000 a night, whereas
Yeah.
in the slow season it's still a $500 cleaning fee, but maybe that's almost the same or similar prices to that nightly rate. It's a little bit easier. It's not as easy to swallow.
Yeah. Does the cleaning actually cost different depending on season?
We don't.
No, we don't. But I mean, I wish there was a way to like say, hey, guest, if you leave the place in a nice condition, you get 50% back, or like there's some tiny, or like and then you could price the labor correct, and then it would be a lot more efficient use of labor. We'd be able to just basically handle more.
You're capturing a new labor force in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, you're mastering the power of marketplaces like Uber and DoorDash have. So I don't know.
One last kind of fun question. Could you just maybe give your 2 cents or clear up some of the cloud around dynamic pricing and things and the buzzwords like machine learning, algorithms, artificial intelligence? Just your thoughts on that, clearing up that smoke around that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's different ways to interpret this this set of terms in some ways, right? So I tend to think of the basic underneath stuff is statistics, numbers, and like what has changed in the last few years is the fact that a lot of statistics that was not doable at a very large scale is suddenly doable. And what that has led to is to say, hey, like, can we build systems that sort of autocorrect themselves? So like, I mean, and you'll see this in all kinds of places, right? So when you're typing out a message, if your swipe comes up with the next word automatically, that's some amount of learning going in there as well. Artificial intelligence is a little, I would say, not something that I was at United, and we used to have this debate that like for a pricing system, it seems like not the right technology almost. Partly because it's a very black box technology to a certain level. It's great at identifying at visual stuff, like it's great at image processing, video processing, and all those kinds of things. But for pure like for spitting out a number and saying, hey, this is the price that you should charge on a certain date. There needs to be some reasoning behind that is well understood by you, by me, by anybody who wants to understand what's happening, right? So most algorithms tend to focus a lot more on the statistics part and use machine learning to find some of the relationships between different things rather than go ahead and do artificial intelligence. Plenty of artificial intelligence, plenty of machine learning, like plenty of people use artificial intelligence as a buzzword where underneath it's running a stats model or something like that. So like our data science team, we've had this debate. We got a question from somebody on our support desk to say like, do you use artificial intelligence for your pricing? And we're like, well, you first have to start by defining what artificial intelligence is. What do you mean by it? And there's this whole set of people who say like the artificial intelligence that is being used today is not really, yes, it can play chess, yes, it can drive a car, but it's not really intelligent. It can't do everything a human being does and be conscious and things like that, right? It's not artificial general intelligence.
It's almost just the collective wisdom anyways, in a sense.
So you guys aren't going to be using neural networks or anything?
Not yet. There might be subparts where we need to figure something out where that goes in. But for the general model, we still want something that's explainable. And again, even at United, this was big. Like, you could come up with a pricing algorithm that potentially comes up with the perfect answer. But one, there is no perfect answer. Every property manager has a different preference as to how their pricing needs to be done. Sure. And two, being able to explain why that number came to be is itself super, super important, right?
Yes.
If somebody asks us tomorrow, like, hey, can you tell us why this summer night is priced at $523? We should be able to go back and say, like, hey, this is what, and our answer shouldn't be that, hey, because the neural network told us so. Kind of.
Yeah, because that is a black box. You don't know. No one knows what's happening within the network, the neural network.
I mean, there is some advancements on explainable AI and things like that, but not there yet.
Wonderful. Anurag, I really appreciate you joining us here. Thank you. It was a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, that was fun. I love nerding out on some pricing. It's always
and I feel like we could keep going.
Yeah, we could go for hours.
Being respectful of your time. Maybe we'll have to do this again. Thank you very much. Everyone who's listening, thank you for listening. Go check out Pricelabs. Go learn about dynamic pricing. And have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.